So what in the world are we doing today? Well, this morning I was reading while I was drinking my morning coffee on one of the Toyota Highlander owners groups, and one of the jokes that was going back and forth had to do with the fuel gauge. When one of the other spouses got in the other one's vehicle to use it, the gas gauge is always on empty. So we're here to talk about why you should not do that and just how expensive it can be. Stick around. Alright, before we get into and start talking about the modern fuel systems, specifically the D4S, which is what Toyota's using and calls their system, let's go back and let's talk about automotive history. Let's talk about cars, say, of the 50s, the 60s, the 70s, and into the 80s. All those cars in a fuel system were basically equipped with a mechanical fuel pump that was mounted to the engine. It ran off the camshaft, it created a vacuum, it drew fuel from the fuel tank in the back of the vehicle, through the fuel line, and into a carburetor, and operated at anywhere from, say, 3 to generally 6 psi. No big deal. Leaks were a lot less likely, leaks were a lot less catastrophic when they did happen, depending on where they happened. And the biggest concern you had generally back in that time era was actually caused by your fueling stations. Back years ago, fueling stations actually used to use steel in-ground tanks. They're subject to rust, corrosion, water intrusion, and a whole host of other problems. That was what generally caused your fueling system problems on an older vehicle. Let's move into the modern era. The modern era, I can't say without exception, but I'm going to say probably without exception, at almost every gas station you go to, and I know any new gas station that's built today, the tank that's being put in the ground is made of I think it's a polypropylene. It is a heavy-duty plastic tank, basically. So by them having the polypropylene tanks in the ground, that is going to remove a lot of the fueling system problems that we had seen in many years past, since they moved away from using steel tanks. Alright, so into the 80s, we moved into an era of fuel injection, to the late 80s and into the early 90s. And the fuel pressures in those vehicles went into the range of 10 to 20 pounds, didn't require a lot of pressure, so you still weren't into a lot of problems. So the systems went to an in-tank fuel pump to generate the pressure, so you still didn't have a lot of problems with leaks and such as that. You would still have a fuel sock on the pump, that's a strainer, and then you would usually have somewhere along the frame rail or somewhere under the hood, you would have an external fuel filter that was required to be serviced. The next generation moving forward, they upped the pressures into 50 to 60 psi range. It goes from somewhere in the middle 90s up into the early to mid 2000s. And what precipitated many of these changes is you had the EPA with an ever-tightening and more stringent regulations to reduce emissions, to increase fuel economy. The automakers also benefited from this because they were able to produce systems that not only achieved the goals of the EPA, but they were also able to increase horsepower. And in an ever-changing world, they moved and pushed and pursued even further into what is known as direct injection. So one of the biggest problems with the direct injected engines are that you end up with carbon building up on the backside of the valves due to the fact that there is no fuel coming through the intake port and across the back of those intake valves, which helps keep them clean, which is due to the positive crankcase ventilation system, and any dirt that happens to possibly pass by your air filter will get stuck on those valves and accumulate, and over a very short period of time begin to build up, and next thing you know, you have no more airflow. So, how did Toyota overcome this? We give you the D4S. The early D4S system began with the Toyota/Lexus moniker. They used it on some of their V8 engines, and as with everything with Toyota, they perfect and they fine-tune and they make things work. Alright, so let's get into exactly why I created this video, and that would be why you do not want to run your system low of fuel. In the fuel tank, there is a supply pump which supplies fuel up to the front of the engine. Well, that pump is submerged in gasoline. Primarily how that pump stays cool and lubricated is staying submerged in that fuel. When you allow your fuel tank to get below 1/4 of a tank of fuel, it begins to start exposing that fuel pump. Alright, so there are two different systems. You have a returnless system and you have a return system. On the returnless system, the fuel is pumped from the tank to the front of the engine, and that is where it stops. There's a pressure regulator that is located inside the pump assembly located in the tank. When the system has achieved enough pressure, it actually has a port that spills over and just dumps the fuel back into the tank internally, so that it never even tries to pump it up here to the front. Now, on the return system pumps the fuel to the front, is regulated, and whatever fuel is not needed at the front of the engine is actually returned to the tank. Now, when the fuel has come up to the engine and has passed through all the lines, and your engine is at operating temperature, it's going to pick up some heat, and it's going to take that fuel, hot fuel, and now it's going to return it to the fuel tank. The way it dissipates the heat in the fuel tank is the amount of fuel that is in the tank. It disperses it across all of the fuel that is in the tank. So, that being said, if you are running your fuel tank at 1/8 of a tank, 1/16 of a tank, the fuel light on, and that fuel is being returned to the tank, it's going to heat that fuel up in the tank. With the fuel being heated up, it's just going to continue. It's a never-ending loop, and the temperature is going to go up and up and up, and you are shortening the life of the fuel pump. You are shortening the life of the fuel injectors. Now, let's talk about the high-pressure injection pump on the D4S system. I recently went and looked this pump up. This pump, by a quality aftermarket manufacturer, which is Delphi, which is the one I found, and this is an aftermarket, probably one of the cheapest websites I can find parts on, Rock Auto, not a sponsor, but I do use them. That pump, for the high pressure pump on this engine, is almost $1,000. That's aftermarket. So, with all that being said, you do not want to run this system out of fuel. The only thing that is going to lubricate and cool that fuel pump will be the fuel that is flowing through it. So if you should run this vehicle out of fuel, that direct injection fuel pump will not have anything in it and can be damaged if you continue to run it low or run out of fuel. There is a risk that you could damage that pump. Alright y'all, save yourself some time and aggravation. When your fuel tank reaches a 1/4 tank, just go ahead and consider it empty and go ahead and pull in and fill it back up. I know things are tough right now and people say they don't have a lot of money to spend on gas, and sometimes people are week to week on money and paychecks. But here's the thing you need to think about. Fill it all the way up and work off of the top side of your tank. Don't ever work off the bottom. Your fuel system will thank you for it, and it'll save you time and aggravation down the road. So, until I can get out a new video, why don't you go watch another one coming on the screen right now.